Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks is quickly approaching. It's one of those days, if you were old enough to comprehend it, you don't forget it ever. As I was growing up, I often heard everyone saying they remembered exactly where they were and what they were doing when, say, JFK was assassinated or when people landed on the moon. Well, 9/11, and I was some 3,000 miles away when those attacks occurred. I was in California. I still remember that day clearly, I'm sure as many do, including my next guest, because we are going to be in conversation today about 9/11 and the effects that had on the American Muslim community and its legacy. And joining me for this conversation is Arsalan Iftikhar. Arsalan Iftikhar is one of those people I used to speak to many times early in my career when I was a Capitol Hill correspondent. At the time, he was with the Council on American Islamic Relations. He is a human rights lawyer. He is the founder of themuslimguy.com, and he is the author of the book Fear of a Muslim Planet, Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. And he joins me via Zoom. Arsalan Iftikhar, it's great to see you again. Thank you for taking this time to talk to me.
Mitch, it's an honor, not only on this 20th anniversary, but as somebody who's known you for 20 years to be on your show here. So thank you for having me.
And I should probably clarify, just for the sakes of this conversation, that you're no longer with the Council on American Islamic Relations.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I've been on my own for a while.
Okay. It's interesting. I was saying in my introduction, September 11th, 2001 is just one of those days you don't forget if you were old enough to really comprehend what was happening. And maybe if not, even if you're a young kid, you probably remember what was going on with your parents that day. It's one of those days that I remember not just finding out about what happened with the attacks, but I remember the entire day. It was very early in my career as a reporter, and I went into the radio station, KPFA in Berkeley, and I went to the news director and I said, okay, I'm here to report whatever you need me to do. And the story they put me on that day, which is actually sort of a big moment, I think, in my own career and sort of foundational and something was very proud of at the time for this decision to put me on, covering the potential, and which became real, backlash and hate crimes towards Muslims in the Bay Area and people who were perceived as potentially being Muslim. We could talk about that dynamic. And I remember talking to an organization called American Muslims for Global Peace in San Jose, and they were shook by what happened, by the attack, of course, itself, but also by what was happening to them personally. And they played for me their voicemail. And it was some of the most horrendous, ugly, hateful things I had ever heard in my life. I have a small clip here of what some of that sounded like.
I'm telling my president to drop nuclear weapons on all of Islam. Death to Islam. Death to American Islam. Message 9, Tuesday, 10:52 a.m. Yeah, I just want to let you know, I hope that the U.S. bombs the living shit on all you motherfucking towelheads in Palestine, the West Bank, I hope you all die.
That last part, I had to delete some of the expletives that were being said. But again, that was just a small sample. It was much longer of the voicemail that was played for me by American Muslims for Global Peace on 9/11 that day. And as I pulled that clip, I was thinking to myself last night that the attacks themselves affected everyone, and they were horrendous and they were shocking. I remember just sitting watching the TV in disbelief for a couple of hours before I actually went into work. What I couldn't imagine is feeling that and then suddenly feeling the entire country with their rage looking at me and people like me, my family, et cetera, et cetera. Can you tell me what you remember on that day?
Yeah, Mitch, like most people, who were of a, formative age, it's not only a day that I'll never forget, it's a day that defined my life. I was a second-year law student at the time. It was 10 days after my 24th birthday. I was in law school at Washington University in St. Louis. And in addition to being a law student at the time, I was also an RA for 50 students on my floor. And on top of that, I was also the executive director of the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations at the time. So we had set up the organization a year prior because obviously there were still discrimination, hate crimes that were going on, across the country against Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and those perceived to be Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And then obviously 9/11 happened, and I was sleeping in my dorm room, and one of my law school classmates woke me up at 8:45 in the morning to tell me what had happened. I remember turning on the television, and I actually watched live as the second plane flew through the second building, and I knew immediately at that point that not only was my life never going to be the same, but the lives of 2 billion Muslims worldwide would never be the same. And so what I did was I jumped to my computer and I wrote a 1,000 word editorial condemnation on behalf of the American Muslim community, which I then proceeded to email and fax to every major newspaper in the country. Back then we still had fax machines. And within like 30 minutes, I received phone calls from the New York Times, USA Today, Chicago Tribune, and about a dozen of other major newspapers. I was a 24-year-old kid at the time.
That's what I was just thinking.
Well, yeah, but it was because you go into triage mode, and they said that they were going to be running my op-ed 2 days later. So a lot of my condemnation editorials appeared in the September 13th, 2001 editions of the New York Times and USA Today and everywhere. And, from that point forward, I was doing, 6 or 7 radio interviews a day, 4 or 5 newspaper interviews a day, and 2 or 3 TV interviews a day, on top of being a law student, on top of being an RA. And then because of that, as you can imagine, when you're going on television on Fox News as the proverbial quote unquote Muslim guy, against Bill O'Reilly or, and debating, Bush administration officials at the time, the bullseye target, comes squarely upon you. And so when you were actually playing those voicemails from September 11th, that sounds like my voicemails for the first 5 to 10 years after 9/11. I've stopped keeping track of the number of death threats that I've gotten over the years after like 1,000. I've had police protection at keynote speeches of mine. It has been, what's most interesting for me and millions of brown Americans like me, Mitch, and the reason I say brown Americans is that on September 10th, 2001, my American identity was never put into question. But on September 12th, 2001, and every day since then for the last 20 years, even though I was born and raised in this country, my Americanness, my identity as an American has always been called into question. And, I always like to, I'd like to share this anecdote, to sort of illustrate that. I once did a live nationally televised debate on a major news network that will remain nameless. All right, it was Fox News. And I'm sitting across from the anchor desk from the anchor, and we cut to commercial break, and they're taking off my microphone and my makeup. And while we're in the commercial break, the news anchor, she looks at me and she goes, "That was a great interview that you did. Your accent didn't come through at all. Where are you from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she goes, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she asked me a third time, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago." And I walked out of her studio. Now, apparently, Mitch, to her, she could not fathom that a brown Muslim man would be able to walk into her television studio, be able to articulate himself in a live 7-minute nationally televised debate without having some sort of stereotypical bobble-headed accent, right? Her notion of what it meant to be American didn't include me and millions of people who look like me. And so it was not only an attack on our country as Americans, but for 7 million American Muslims and 2 billion Muslims worldwide, it was also a duality of a hijacking of our religion, which has been used by right-wing extremists on both sides of the political aisle globally to help perpetuate the collapse of civilizations Orientalist theory, and which has led to perpetual war in the last 20 years, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, things like that. And so, it was for a lot of Americans, it was not only a tragedy that they'll never forget, but again, for millions of brown folks, and when I say brown folks, I'm including Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, and those perceived to be Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. We'll get into the hate crimes a little bit, in terms of, how really anybody who could be perceived as the other after 9/11 was targeted, and, how we need to, address, the rise of, white supremacy and global racism in ways, because of what's happened in the last 20 years.
You mentioned right-wing extremists on both sides. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, obviously the hijackers and the extremists, on my side of the velvet rope, committed this act, but then also the right-wing extremists, that used not only 9/11, but everything around it as a pretext for perpetual war. Again, Iraq, Afghanistan. I mean, let's not forget, it's funny, and you can appreciate this, right around 9/11 and the years after that, we had the George W. Bush administration, right? We had John Ashcroft as Attorney General. We had Donald Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense. I mean, Dick Cheney was Dick Cheney. And back then, with everything that was going on, and I think you can appreciate the absurdity in this, liberals, progressives, people on the left, like at that point, when stuff was going on during the Bush administration, we were like, OMG, there is no way that anybody could be a worse president than George W. Bush. Everybody would nod their head in agreement. And then, of course, 10 years later, Donald Trump's like, hold my beer, right? But we often forget about the George W. Bush administration. And, not only the hate crimes that occurred, but the dragnets. I mean, in the days, weeks, and months after 9/11, the Bush Justice Department, then headed up by Attorney General John Ashcroft, started summarily rounding up brown men all over the country. Young Muslim, Arab, South Asian men were being rounded up without any warrants, without any access to legal counsel, without even contacting their families, and just disappeared. There was, and at the time, I was I was one of the first Muslim civil rights lawyers, who was a full-time staff attorney in Washington, D.C., dealing with all this, right? I would have called, Muslim mothers from around the country frantically call me saying my kid, took this city bus to community college today, and the FBI scooped him up from the city bus, and I haven't heard from him in 2 months. And then 9 weeks later, she gets a call from an immigration detention facility in Louisiana, even though the kid was born in the United States, because he's being held there incommunicado. When she finally travels to Louisiana to visit her son, half of his face is swollen because of the beatings that he got in prison. She can't even recognize her own son. There's dozens of stories like that. The first hate crimes murder that occurred after 9/11 happened 4 days after 9/11. And of course, to highlight the absurdity of hate crimes murders, it was against a man who was neither an Arab nor a Muslim. Right? He was an Indian Sikh man named Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was a gas station attendant in Mesa, Arizona, and wore a turban and beard in observance of his Sikh faith. And the irony and the tragic irony of not only hate crimes, but also sort of the jingoism and the xenophobia that sort of percolated after 9/11 and in the 20 years since, Mr. Sodhi, when he was going in the 3 days after the attack, he was so aware of the Islamophobia and the racism that was prevalent in America that he actually, most people don't know this, he actually wore a red, white, and blue turban to work every single day after that for 3 days. And even that didn't save his life. Because a 44-year-old man named Frank Roque walked into his Chevron gas station in Mesa, Arizona, and shot him point blank in the face, killing him instantly. And as the television cameras were taking Frank Roque away in handcuffs, the TV cameras started to congregate, and all he repeated, almost like a mantra, was, "I am the real American, I'm the real hero, I'm the true patriot." On the same day as the Sodhi murder, there were actually 3 other hate crimes murders that occurred in America. One against a Pakistani Muslim convenience store owner outside San Antonio, Texas. An Egyptian Coptic Christian was shot and killed outside of his import-export store in Los Angeles. And there was one more hate crimes murder as well. Of course, this was all, sort of lost in the fray, in terms of what we were dealing with at the time. We had, daily drive-by shootings at American mosques. Muslim women who wear the headscarf, the hijab, were routinely assaulted on the street and beaten. And so this is something that, sadly was a turning point, for our human race. And, we're still dealing with the repercussions of it 20 years later.
Talk to me more about your time as an attorney with the Council on American Islamic Relations. This is when we first met. I used to come down to your Capitol Hill office to talk to you. We were covering quite a bit what was happening around sort of FBI, domestic incursion into Muslim communities. You mentioned a young man who was apprehended by the FBI and eventually, I think it was FBI, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, and eventually wound up in an immigration detention facility, even though he was an American citizen. Was that legal? Were there legal changes that occurred, or were these things were these extrajudicial things that were happening immediately?
Everything was extrajudicial. We didn't know what to do at the time, right? They didn't know. They were talking about suspending habeas corpus at the time. Stuff was real back then, right? Again, we forget that. We often sort of, sadly now, 20 years later, when we talk about 9/11, the post 9/11 world, we tend to talk about it in abstractions, right? And we tend to forget that it had a real impact on everyday people. I was a national legal director for the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is the largest Muslim civil rights group in America. And I was the first attorney that was ever hired by them. And I was the first attorney, full-time Muslim civil rights lawyer hired by any Muslim organization in America. And so I, as a staff of one with like a support staff of like 5 or 6 folks, we were dealing with close to 900 cases in the first 6 months alone of hate crimes, racial profiling, discrimination, employment discrimination, people being fired summarily from their jobs. And we were dealing with, we were dealing on a shoestring budget with things that should, require the, ACLU's budget of $120 million, right? But we didn't have that. Everything was done out of a labor of love, not only as Americans, but also as Muslims, as people, who are, driven to do good. And, we received death threats every single day, bomb threats on our buildings. The FBI, has, they sent somebody to jail for 1 year for a threat that they made, against us because we happened to be 1 block from the U.S. Capitol, as you remember. So obviously any threat on us was sadly automatically a threat on the U.S. Capitol. And so we would get Capitol Police, Joint Terrorism Task Force from FBI, bomb sniffing dogs all the time. I was national legal director during the anthrax scare. So imagine every single day you're opening mail and white powder is falling on your lap. And then you have to call your FBI contacts. They have to come with hazmat suits to make sure. And you have to sit
that happened. You were having white powder falling on your lap
on a semi-weekly basis. Literally, you're just opening your mail and then white powder falls off, and you're like, okay. And then you sit there until the FBI comes and says, okay, you're clear. Imagine that for years and years and years. Getting packages with dead pigs parts, literally like carcasses of pigs, pork, snouts, and entrails. It was terrible, but the history of any civil rights struggle in America is fraught with hatred and animosity and ignorance. And so what I've tried to do in the last 20 years of my life, even though I feel like I've aged 40, is to be a part of that conversation, to try to, use, my education as a human rights lawyer, my voice, my writing to help to humanize 1/4 of the world's population. One in 4 human beings on Earth is a Muslim. There are nearly 2 billion Muslims on the face of the earth today. There is sadly no demographic group in the world, whether it's in the United States or in Europe or even in Asia now, with places like China, with the Uyghur Muslims, of the Rohingya, with the Myanmar Muslims, where ethnic cleansing is happening, genocide is happening, internment camps. There are a million Muslims in internment camps in China with impunity because of the fact that Islamophobia, sadly, has become so mainstreamed in every part of the world today. And
so you see a connection between what's happening in China, what's happening in Myanmar, to the 9/11 attacks?
Well, no, to the rise of global Islamophobia, right? So, if a minority demographic group is, has historically for the last 20 years, every public opinion poll shows, the most hated demographic group in these Western countries, then, when Eastern countries decide to, undertake campaigns of ethnic cleansing or genocide against that hated demographic group, you can see that there's not a lot of meaningful pushback, right, from world leaders today. So it's something that, we are the lowest rung of society's totem pole in the world today. And because of that, we have a million Muslims in internment camps, and in China still doing business as usual. And they have continued. I mean, they're buying off governments left and right, trying to whitewash what they're doing over there.
Of course, things changed for everyone when 9/11 happened. It's really remarkable to think about how different the world is today than it was before 9/11. And oftentimes I'll be talking to history professors, and we'll start getting into this topic, and they'll say, all my students, they've known nothing else but a post 9/11 world. But I think we can say, and if you disagree with this, you'll let me know, that Islamophobia was not born on 9/11, probably changed on 9/11.
Yes.
What was Islamophobia like before 9/11?
Well, that's a really good question. I always tell people two things. I say, first of all, not only did Islamophobia was not born on 9/11, and more importantly, for people who are younger too, I would say that Donald Trump did not create Islamophobia, and it's not going to end with Donald Trump either. Now, he took it to the next level, and we're definitely going to get into that today. But, when it comes to Islamophobia before 9/11, to be quite honest with you, Mitch, most Westerners really didn't know anything, if at all, about Muslims or Islam, right? So, if you look, especially within the American context, the vast majority, the majority of Muslims, we have a very diverse community here. We have near 7 to 10 million American Muslims of every color of the rainbow, right? We have 25% of American Muslims who are African Americans, who have historically been here since the first slave ships came here, over 400 years ago, mainly concentrated in major urban metropolitan areas. Then we have another 25% of American Muslims who are of Arab descent. One of the biggest misnomers that you all often hear, from Americans and people who don't know anything about Muslims is that, that all Muslims are Arabs and that all Arabs are Muslims. And again, nothing could be further from the truth. Again, as I mentioned, only 1/4 of Muslims in America are of Arab descent. Worldwide, only 20% of the world's Muslim population is Arab, right? The largest Muslim population is actually in Indonesia with over 1 billion Muslims. But sadly, since 9/11, you sort of seen that interchangeable usage of Islam equating with Arab culture and Arabs equating with Muslims. Even in America, the Arab American community, close to 40 to 50% are Christian. If you look at Dearborn, Michigan, if you look at a lot of these, Lebanese families that came at the turn of the century. So, we have so much diversity in our own community. So, for example, when people talk about racial profiling, that's laughable, right? Because Muslims look like you, Mitch, they're as white as you are, and they're as brown as me. I'm not Arab. I don't, and so these are the sorts of heuristic changes that we've seen in Western policy, right? When it comes to talking about racial profiling before 9/11 and after 9/11, before 9/11, the major, racial profiling adage was driving while black, right? Which still obviously exists today. And obviously 9/11 added another layer of flying while brown. Right. And so, I've had friends who have literally been kicked off airplane flights before because they did not smile back at the flight attendant. Even though they were sitting in first class, they went to the Tufts Fletcher School of Diplomacy. They were kicked off just because they were brown, olive skin, Muslim males. And we still continue to see that today. And so Islamophobia before, 9/11, sort of started to percolate in Hollywood. If you look back at, the first Indiana Jones movies and sort of their depictions of Egyptians as sort of backward savage people who eat monkey brains. And then in the mid 1990s, you saw, Arnold Schwarzenegger in True Lies and the Crimson Jihad. And then everything since then in terms of Hollywood, in terms of the bad guy, was us, people who looked at it like me, right? So whether it's 24 with Kiefer Sutherland or Homeland with Claire Danes or Jack Ryan with John Krasinski, on Amazon, the proverbial bad guy was always a smarmy, olive-skinned Muslim Arab man, right? So the proverbial bad guy, I would say, shifted from the Red Scare, the Hunt for Red October, the communist Soviet threat, to the Green Scare of, look out for the Muslims, not only that are abroad, but I remember, one season of the famous Fox show 24 with Kiefer Sutherland. At the time, it was the number one rated show in America after 9/11, and they actually had an entire season storyline about a Muslim family, a mother, a father, a teenage son, as a sleeper cell next door, right? As a sleeper terrorist cell. Basically sending the message to the average American, hey, don't trust the brown people who live in your neighborhood, right? And this has led to public opinion polls, which showed that 21 public opinion poll once showed that nearly 1/4 of Americans, I think it was like 22 or 24%, said that they wouldn't even want Muslims as their next door neighbor, right? So people think 3 out of 300 million Americans, extrapolated, 75 million Americans believe that I am too inherently dangerous to live next door to just because of my religious identity. So you can imagine the sort of layers that generations, can you imagine the Muslim kids who were born after 9/11? They were born into the post 9/11 world, right? And they, these are the kids that are being bullied on school playgrounds, being called ISIS and having their headscarves pulled off. And they've known nothing else. At least we you and I were, I was 24, we were formed adults when 9/11 happened. And even then that shook us, right? So just imagine the kids, right, who saw the racism and the vitriol and the xenophobia coming from their parents. And then, extrapolating that one generation down to sort of the rise of white supremacy that we're seeing, the still rise of global Islamophobia worldwide, in addition to the rise of anti-Semitism and all the other forms of, xenophobia in the world today. We have a long way to go as a human race.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Arsalan Iftikhar, human rights lawyer, founder of themuslimguy.com, and author of the book that is out this year called Fear of a Muslim Planet, Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. As you were talking about the TV show 24 and this idea of be fearful of the Muslim next door, I couldn't help but think of the small town I grew up in, and this was before 9/11, but there was a Muslim family that I was close to, but they were the only Muslim family in the neighborhood. And other than white or Mexican folks, that's sort of what made up the people where I came from. They were sort of it. And I remember, when you talk about, be fearful of the Muslim next door, even before 9/11, they were fearful. They were harassed, especially the youngest kid who was still in the elementary school. So yeah, I don't know if that.
Well, 1991, we had Gulf War I. Yeah. Obviously, so the remnants of the Iran hostage crisis from the 1970s. Global watershed events involving our own, foreign policy and the Muslim world, in the last 40 years, has not been a positive one. And so you're absolutely right. This is something that, has percolated. And it's been a, part of most Western Muslim diaspora's experience. And as you can imagine, 9/11 just sort of, took a whole, new stratospheric level.
Post 9/11 and the last 20 years, there is a cultural element of this, of just blatant personal discrimination. And then there's also legal aspects of this. How would you characterize the legal aspects of this over the last 20 years, post, enactment of such things as the Patriot Act, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security? How has legal structures changed, especially when it comes for Muslim people in this country?
It's changed completely. As you mentioned, just 6 weeks after the 9/11 attacks in October 2001, just as we were getting ready to, carpet bomb Afghanistan back into the Stone Ages, the U.S. Senate passed a 300-page piece of legislation called the United in Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act, better known by its acronym USA Patriot. Most people, you can see, I remember the acronym 20 years later because of the impact that it's had. It was a 300-page piece of legislation that was passed in the middle of the night. It was literally passed at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that one piece of legislation trumped over 50 federal laws and statutes that were already on the book. It broadly expanded the definition of the term domestic terrorism to basically include anybody that local police agencies wanted to define as a domestic terrorist. The sheriff of Hennepin County, Minnesota, which is the home of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, after the passage of USA Patriot, designated local college student groups Anti-Racist Action and Students Against War to be domestic terrorists against auspices of the USA Patriot Act. It allowed for, and still allows for, law enforcement agencies to come into your home without a warrant, without any probable cause of any criminal activity, go through your computers, hard drives, anything that they want, and then actually not even have to notify you that they came to your house, right? So they literally can come into your house when you're not there. They can take your hard drive, take anything that they want, and then they don't even have to let you know that they were there, which obviously runs afoul of, the due process clause of the Constitution in a multitude of ways. It required...
Well, has this been challenged in the courts, and have the courts ruled it?
Many, many times. But again, when it comes to the auspices of national security, federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court has always granted great deference to the executive and the executive, which includes the Department of Justice. It required USA Patriot actually required college registrars to hand over information on their own students and then placed a gag order on those registrars from letting the students even know that the feds had actually come to look for them. They, at the time, Blockbuster videos still existed. And so, when I would go on TV, I'd be like, they could actually, see what movies you're renting at Blockbuster, which they could at the time. Netflix at the time was still the mail-in.
Yeah.
CDs, and they could see what you were mailing in and out. I always say stuff was real, and then we forget that this law has not only not sunsetted, but it's continued onwards, and there have been a multitude of laws of practices that have been undertaken by American law enforcement to target Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in ways that other minority demographic groups were not targeted, and it's something that still is still relevant today.
I mean, when you mentioned it was real, and it was real, it's also interesting to think about how some things were different at this period of time. There wasn't internet at the time, but people weren't going there to get their news. Not most people, anyways. It wasn't dominating the news. The news was still dominated by a few television and cable outlets, a few radio stations, and then the major newspapers. What was your experience?
Hey Mitch, what's a newspaper?
It's this thing that was actually printed on paper. It shrunk over the years before it just overall disappeared. Yeah. But you would oftentimes see people on a train with it folded underneath their arm. Sometimes had useful information, sometimes not.
Yeah, and usually when there was not, they'd print a correction the next day on that same broadsheet, say, hey, you know what? We got that wrong. Our bad.
It made you feel better about yourself, like, oh, I'm not the only one. Well,
not only that, but it actually made you feel better about the world.
Yeah.
You're right. The internet did exist, but we didn't have social media back then, right? Yeah. We didn't have the ubiquitous sort of 24/7 instant gratification, instant communication happening, viral, memes and fake news and disinformation that perpetuated, sort of the worst instincts of our human race. And even then, it was still really bad, right? So imagine, like, letters to the editor in newspapers, calling for, not only racial profiling of Muslims. I mean, there were. I remember there was a USA Today poll that was conducted once that said that 40% of Americans thought that Arabs and Muslims should have our own security lines at airports for secondary screening just based on our identity. 20 to 30% of Americans at one point thought that Arabs and Muslims should be required to carry special IDs on us at all times. Similar to the yellow stars of David that many, Jewish folks wore, in Nazi Germany. The talk of, I'll be honest with you, man, like, I have, since that day, there's not been one day that I have not woken up mentally prepared for the talk of Muslim internment camps. And we've seen that from time to time, thrown about by, right-wing Republican, candidates. Islamophobia has become a central part of the Republican political ideological platform today. You look at, people talk about Donald Trump. Forget Trump. When he was running for the Republican nomination, there were 17 candidates that were running for it. And I can name all 17 of them and the Islamophobic stuff that they said on the campaign trail. Newt Gingrich, a former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, once said that Sharia law, Islamic Sharia law, is a mortal threat to the United States of America. Now, of course, he probably has never read the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which actually says that only the Constitution and nothing but the Constitution will be the supreme law of the land. So I always say that, whenever these Republicans talk about Sharia law coming to take over America, not only should they not be allowed to run for president, but they should retroactively fail ninth grade civics class because they know nothing about the United States Constitution. But again, facts don't matter, right? When you're dealing with fear, when you're dealing with misinformation, when you're trying to score cheap political points, this is the rhetoric that we've seen from right-wingers, not only in the United States, but it's metastasized to Europe. You look at the rise of the European right-wing, whether it's Marine Le Pen in France or Geert Wilders in Holland or Viktor Orban in Hungary. Even in Asia, again, as I said, 1 million Muslims in concentration camps in China. The Rohingya Muslim, 1 million Rohingya Muslims have been ethnically cleansed from Myanmar, which was formerly known as Burma, into neighboring Bangladesh under the watch of 1991 Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. I've never seen a further fall from grace that during the watch of a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, she has whitewashed and rubber stamped the ethnic cleansing of 1 million Muslims into a neighboring country. And people can do this because they see that Islam and Muslims are hated all over the world.
It was heartbreaking. Aung San Suu Kyi, she was somebody in the early years after 9/11 that I looked to for strength and principle. And, when she was under house arrest at the time. Let's talk about the liberal side here. We were talking about the right wing. Let's talk about the liberal side here. Because right now,
yes,
we are seeing, and I have seen, I think from people that think of themselves as well-meaning, talking about the Texas anti-abortion law and basically equating Texas with the Taliban. I've seen cartoons of women in Texas wearing burqas. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts about that are twofold, Mitch. Number one, I'm not surprised. I'm in some ways I can't blame him because the meta narratives that Americans for 20 years have been receiving so on a daily breakfast, lunch, and dinner is that Muslim culture is backwards. Right. That's whether it's, the sort of projecting our own Western liberal notions of what, feminism, what a modern woman should look like. Right. That a woman who wears a headscarf is somehow oppressed. But, a bikini clad, Britney Spears, wearing next to nothing is somehow empowered. The projection of those Western liberal feminist, ideals on the rest of the world and sort of the view of Muslim culture as backwards is something that it can't come as a surprise to anybody who has sort of been alive for the last 20 years. But again, like you said, it shows that Islamophobia is not limited exclusively to right-wing actors, right? That there is liberal Islamophobia. I write about it in my book. Even people like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. I write in the book that during the last couple of Democratic National Conventions, DNCs, during their primetime speeches, whenever Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton would invoke American Muslims, it was always in the context of counterterrorism, right? Bill Clinton's like, if you are a Muslim and you love America, we want you here on our side. It implies, first of all, that we Muslims are no terrorists, right? We don't, I've never seen a politician give a speech, asking for white people to, turn into white supremacists, in their families or in their neighborhoods. The whole see something, say something. When it comes to Muslims, we're only seen through the realm of religion and terrorism. We're sort of seen as two-trick ponies, as I like to say. And, even sort of the imagery that we've seen in political campaigns, you might remember, and many of your listeners and viewers might remember that, during the 2008 Democratic primary, when Barack Obama was running against Hillary Clinton, it was a knockdown, battle between the two. And you might remember that there was a photograph of Barack Obama, then Senator Barack Obama from my home state of Illinois, during a trip to Africa. He was dressed in white Kenyan garb. He was wearing a white turban and was a white garb. And that was leaked to the press, to sort of make that insinuation that Barack Obama was a Muslim. But what most people don't know is that it was actually leaked by Hillary Clinton's campaign. And that just gives, there's usually silence in the room when I say that. Because it shows, even to well-meaning liberals, that we pander to as many of the same anti-Muslim, sort of just a racist, xenophobic undertones of the American populace. With the Obama campaign in June 2008, at an event in Detroit, Michigan, during a photo opportunity with a group photo, two Muslim women who wear the hijab, the headscarf, were actually yanked out of the photo opportunity with Barack Obama by Barack Obama's own campaign volunteers. Right? They understood that even the optics of two Muslim women in a group setting, in a group photo, with the candidate, with Barack Obama at the time, was so politically radioactive and toxic that they needed to yank them out. Now, of course, Barack called them the next day to apologize, but the damage had already been done, right? So this is something that, is, for many of us who have been in, this kind of, civic life for the last 20 years is a reality, but it's also a reality for, an entire young generation of young Muslims who were born into this, right? They read about 9/11 on, in history books or in, National Geographic documentaries, and sort of have to deal with the repercussions of it. And so this is a generational issue that we're dealing with.
Could that happen? Something, say, that would happen with Barack Obama's campaign. Is that something that you think could still happen today? And how do you think things are now compared to, say, 10 years ago?
I mean, things ebb and flow, right? But, we are one bad act by a brown Muslim man away from, perhaps a great unraveling. We see mass murders, acts of terrorism committed every single day by white supremacists and, right-wing male actors. That, number one, are never called terrorism, right? The terrorism double standard in our media, I've written several chapters about that, is astonishing. I mean, there have been University of Alabama, Georgia State University studies that I write about in my book, which show that criminal acts acts of mass murder conducted by Muslims receive 350% or more coverage than those same acts committed by white men, right? And whether or not something's, labeled as terrorism. Many of your listeners and viewers will remember a couple of years ago, a 58-year-old white man named Stephen Paddock killed 50 people and injured 500 at a Las Vegas concert when he, in a hotel suite with rifles on tripods, was just shooting everybody at a huge concert, killing 60 people, injuring 500 people. To this day, they don't know why he did it. But I can promise you one thing. Number one, if he was a brown Muslim man, it would have been called terrorism instantly. And number two, if it was a brown Muslim man, we would still be talking about it today, right? That's what we're talking about, is this sort of the double standard of how brown people are treated versus how white people are treated in America today. And that's something that obviously we've dealt with, in the history of our civil rights, movements here in the United States. And now we're sort of at a millennial chapter of that. And more importantly, tomorrow it'll be somebody else. That's the key, Mitch, is that, I always tell my audiences that, so my second book right before this was actually called Scapegoats. And the reason that I called it Scapegoats is actually very deliberate, because as you know, the term scapegoats is a biblical term. It has been around since time immemorial. It was from the book of Leviticus about a goat that was set off into the wilderness, and the high priest placed all of society's ills upon its undeserving head. And the point here, Mitch, is that we've always had scapegoats in human history, right? That from the Holocaust to Jim Crow to internment of Japanese Americans in World War II to Muslims and Arabs today, and most importantly, that it will be somebody else tomorrow, right? A famous quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller that first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak up because I was not a socialist. And that is why the concept of allyship is so important to me, right? That is why it is so important for people of conscience, for people from other minority demographic groups to come together, in good times and in bad, so that we can ensure that when any community anywhere in the world feels persecuted, feels disenfranchised, feels marginalized, that there are external allies out there who are willing to speak truth to power to help protect the rights of all people. Because I always say, as a civil rights lawyer, that the protection of the civil right of one human being is the protection of the civil right of all human beings. And we have to understand that that is, a sort of a central part of our American constitutional system. And again, as people of conscience, to, sort of use our lives for good, right? To whatever we do, whether we're a journalist, whether we're a lawyer, whether we're a teacher, whether we're an environmental engineer, that whatever we do is, has a greater good outside of ourselves, right? We live in a sort of self-centered, narcissistic world today, and to do things for the greater good, I think, is something that keeps me going, to be quite honest with you. I mean, like, you cannot be a human rights lawyer, and you can't be a Muslim human rights lawyer unless you are an eternal optimist. And at the end of the day, having faith in the human spirit, overcoming the dark days that we've seen for a very long time.
Arsalan Iftikhar is a human rights attorney. He's founder of the MuslimGuy.com, and you can find the MuslimGuy.com online. And he's the author of the book Fear of a Muslim Planet, Global Islamophobia, and the New World Order. Arsalan Iftikhar, old friend, thank you for doing this today and joining us and telling us your story.
Mitch, it is an honor, and thank you for being one of those voices 20 years ago and till today, who is open and willing to give a voice to the voiceless.
I was around good people, so that helps.
It's great to see you, Mitch.